Thank you, everyone. Look, welcome to our session on Infoveillance. My name is Stephen Wyatt. I'll be your moderator for this evening. I'm a prof at the University of Moncton, campus of Edmundston in New Brunswick, on unceded Wolastoqiyik territory. Ici, c'est une université francophone, alors pour les francophones qui vont assister à cette rencontre, la plupart de cette rencontre va passer en anglais, mais on est au moins un de nos conférenciers est francophone, d'autres pour comprendre le français. Si vous aimeriez poser des questions, vous pouvez le faire en français ou en anglais, comme vous voudrez. Was just a little message for the French speakers. We'll be doing this conference mainly in English, but you're welcome to pose questions in English or in French as you wish, and I'll sort of mention that a little bit later. We've got sort of half a dozen people in at the moment, so thank you very much for joining us on a Tuesday night. Our subject, as you all know, is Infoveillance. So every one of us at the moment, whether you're on your intelligent phone, or whether you've downloaded the COVID tracking app from the federal government, if you've got a social media account, even if you're using an Air Miles card when you do your grocery shopping, you're all you're all promoting Infoveillance. And this is something we're embarking in, we're jumping on board voluntarily, even enthusiastically. We're all contributing to this in our daily lives. We're contributing and we're building a mountain of data around what we're doing, who we're doing it with, what we like, what we don't like. And increasingly we're recognizing, or we're knowing that this has got value, this mountain of data. It's data because it's got value because it's telling people about what we're interested in. It's telling them about what our preferences are, who our friends are, what we're going to do. And Infoveillance here is now the combination of information technologies and surveillance technologies. And that's providing a whole set of new tools on how other organizations can use this information, what they can do with it. And not just how they're using it, but also what they're going to do, why they're going to use it, what they're going to do with it. Are they going to try and sell us something, or direct us, or influence us in particular ways? So that's what we're here to talk about tonight. We've got a group of 4 people who represent different fields. This is a multidisciplinary group. In fact, the origins of this go back a year and a half now. And the Royal Society wanted to bring together a small working group to look at issues of data privacy. And that was how we framed it originally, data privacy. What you see, or the speakers that you see with us today are the people who contributed to that, and actually contributed to redefining and developing this concept to take us further than just data and further than just privacy. And they will present some of that to you this evening. The process, or what we sought to do with this group, was initially to prepare just a series of articles to go into the conversation. The publishing format that provides academics and different researchers with the opportunity to share their information in a more informal way. Now, this was all before COVID. Obviously, with COVID, we've all been spending much more time online. Our telephones are doing much more work. The government's COVID tracking app is tracking us if we've got that installed and telling us whether we're at risk or not. And this has just lifted this whole question up another level. And that's why we're here tonight, is to share some of this with you, to look at some of these options. On the website for the COE, there is there's a publication both in English and in French, which brings together the 4 texts that have been written by our 4 experts here. So look, I will just do a quick round table of who we've got around the table tonight. First of all, we've got Benoit Dupont. Benoit is a criminologist. He's got a research chair in cybersecurity at the University of Montreal. Obviously, he's a francophone, and he's been looking very much at the way that at the different surveillance technologies and how these surveillance technologies are changing how we're changing the way we use them. So Benoit, if you can just sort of wave your hand so everybody knows who you are, that's Benoit. Our second speaker will be David Lyon. David is a sociologist. He's the director of the Surveillance Studies Center at Queen's University. And he's been doing a lot more work on the ideas of surveillance, on social sorting, and he's directing an international project on big data surveillance. So David, if you can say hi to everyone, please. Thank you. We've got Anatoly Gruz. Anatoly is information technologist. He's got a social research chair in social media at Ryerson University. And he's very much looking at the different impacts of technology, of networks on how they're influencing what we can do, where our information is coming from, going to, and what is happening with that. So Anatoly, if you can say hi.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you. Fourth speaker is Jane Bailey. You always have to have a lawyer somewhere or other. You know, any group, you have to have a lawyer. So Jane is our, sorry, Jane, my apologies. Jane is a professor in law at University of Ottawa, but she's been particularly looking at issues of equality and access. And so she's the director of the Equality Project, been looking at how these issues of technology impact upon different groups, and particularly those groups who are seeking they're seeking equality. They are not equal, they're not being recognized as being equal. And so what is the impact on each of those? So that's our group who is around the table tonight. We'll be speaking in that order. I am not an expert in social media and technology. My Facebook account, I never visit that. I don't carry an iPhone. This is not my field. I am a forest policy person. And so I am quite inapt to contribute to the discussion. I admit that right from the beginning, but this is what I have found as being part of this group, and I have tremendously enjoyed this group because this is not part of what I usually do. But this is really something that this issue of infoveillance is something that is affecting every one of us. And this is what I have really brought out of this. This has helped me to understand the significance of these issues, which basically I had not considered, I had not looked at. I have found working with this group of 4 people tremendously enlightening, and I really hope and I expect that you will find that also enlightening, and you will learn a lot from them this evening. So I want to thank the whole group for joining us. Just a tiny little bit of housekeeping. We'll go through, or the program for now is that each of our speakers will do a brief presentation of about 5 minutes or so. I encourage you, then we will turn it over to a question period. Please send us your questions through chat or raise a hand to indicate that you have a question. There's not many of us on the line here tonight, so in fact, if I can, then I'll open up mics and people can ask their own questions. But we'll do the questions after all of our 4 speakers have finished. And so I will, while Benoit is speaking, if you want to put a question directly to Benoit, for example, please put it down on the chat, and we'll take that as soon as as soon as we've been around the table. So look, with that, I would like to thank everybody very much once again for joining us, and I will hand us over to Benoit. Benoit, to you.
Merci beaucoup, Steven, pour votre très amicale présentation, et merci à la Société Royale pour l'opportunité de partager avec vous ces quelques réflexions. When I was invited by my very eminent colleagues on this panel to join the newly formed Royal Society Infoveillance working group at the beginning of 2020, no one really could have imagined the turmoil that the world would soon face and how it would really reconfigure many of our assumptions about social interactions and social norms. Like in many areas of other human activities beyond health, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted what I think are the deep social fractures that were very often obscured by the frantic pace of technological innovation that have become the defining features of modern societies. In the paper I had in mind for the series In the Conversation, what I wanted to do initially was to explore the infoveillance infrastructure that is converging around a number of interconnected technologies, such as cloud computing and its limitless data storage capacities, 5Gs, and its promise to have the Internet of Things colonize every facet of our lives, and artificial intelligence that seeks to help humans make sense of the ocean of data generated by modern surveillance systems. And what happened is that the pandemic accelerated this convergence, and I ended up in the paper reflecting on how infoveillance technologies were reconfigured to address the public health, and by extension, to a certain extent as well, the economic crisis that was created by COVID-19. So in a nutshell, Big Brother became Doc Brother in response to the fear and uncertainty created by the virus. And some countries, so in the paper I kind of examined how some countries like South Korea pooled tens of telecommunications and banking databases to be able to trace the contact of infected citizens within minutes, while others such as Hong Kong and Singapore deployed geolocation technologies to track people in quarantine and try to automate the tracking and the surveillance of people. In other countries like Israel, just the anti-terrorism infrastructure and the surveillance apparatus that usually is used to track terrorist activity was just shifted to public health role, and was used to try to predict who might be infected by the virus. And in many other countries, such as Canada, governments invited their citizens to download and to use contact tracing apps with very various levels of success. And the private sector was also very keen and very active to get involved in the game. So startups started to offer facial recognition technologies, drones and robots telling people what to do, what not to do, smart watches and smart bracelets that are tracking workers in warehouses and slaughterhouses and many other plants, and making sure they comply with social distancing rules. And what I questioned in the paper, in the piece, were not the motivations of the decision makers and the entrepreneurs who were promoting those technologies, because I think they were genuinely trying to help individuals and businesses deal with the pandemic. What I was questioning were more the new expectations and the future uses of this acceleration of a surveillance mindset, which in my view is likely to remain and to consolidate when and after a vaccine becomes available. So my colleagues on the panel, David, Jane, and Anatoly, will talk about the democratic, the regulatory, the equality challenges creating by this sprawling infoveillance infrastructure being put in place. And my contribution to this effort, this collective effort, has been to try to illustrate how COVID-19 has fueled the development of ubiquitous surveillance tools that are merging very powerful technologies that I think will remain in one form or another. And I think we need to investigate, the structure of these new hybrids, technological hybrids. We need to investigate, we need to question, and possibly we need to resist and to put in place structures of resistance. I think Scott calls that hidden transcripts, or ways to kind of resist, to make sure those of what are the most intrusive tools are kept under control, and that we retain our humanity. So I'm going to stop here and let my colleagues take over.
Okay, thank you very much, Benoit, for starting us off on that and for giving us a quick overview of the technology that has brought us to where we are now. So I will hand it over to David now. If you can pick up the ball and pick up the baton and run with it from there, please, David.
Merci bien. Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis ravi d'être avec vous ce soir. I'm going to pick up where Benoit left off. I agree with the thrust of what he's saying there, and I think we can take it along further in the conversation. I too have altered various ways of thinking about this topic, even as the pandemic has unfolded. I've been invited, as I suppose many academics have, to speak about the pandemic in different contexts. And just in the last couple of months, I've given talks in Hong Kong and India and Italy. And in each place, trying to think about the situation there and corresponding beforehand with colleagues there, I've realized how much we have in common, in fact, between very different situations in terms of the kinds of issues that are facing us. Again, in trying to write about these things and try to analyze them and get some kind of a handle on a very rapidly changing situation, I've started to think in terms of pandemic surveillance. And that's a useful term for me because it clearly refers to the sorts of ways in which surveillance is growing very rapidly in relation to things like contact tracing and massive platforms, data platforms for health data. But it also has a neat ambiguity because it's a double entendre. I want to suggest that there is also a pandemic of surveillance, that really surveillance has been growing hugely over the past few months in ways that are unprecedented and largely unmitigated by regulations and so on and so forth. So there is very rapid growth of surveillance. It's like a pandemic itself. So there's that double entendre that I'm beginning to work with, I suppose play with if it's a double entendre, but it's really pretty serious what I'm trying to look at. Also, since we started meeting together as a group, there have been various interventions. We were all aware of the work of Shoshana Zuboff, for example, which has been much celebrated around the world, and her very large, well, 700 pages, I've never written a book of 700 pages, her very large book on surveillance capitalism. But I also want to take us a little bit beyond what she has been saying. Most recently, very recently, Ron Deibert gave the Massey lectures, and I guess that you may well have listened to the Massey lectures or even read the book by now. But he too is dealing with these issues. He called them reset, and it has to do with reclaiming the internet for civil society. And that I find is very much in tune with the sorts of remarks that I want to make. But there's also the fact that the Privacy Commissioner, the Federal Privacy Commissioner of Canada, released the annual report this year, and it exudes frustration with the limits of the kind of legal system that we have to try to deal with this phenomenon that we're all discussing. So in my in the little article that I did for the conversation and that we discussed in our group, I was talking about the ways in which COVID-19 has stirred up a storm of surveillance and made that point. But there's also the sense in which, quite apart from the direct health data issues and contact tracing and so on, the pandemic has also had huge effects on surveillance in areas of remote working, remote shopping, remote learning, and so on. And these are part of the pandemic surveillance that I want us to think about, because it isn't only in contact tracing and those kinds of areas where surveillance innovations are being made. Huge innovations are being made by employers, for example, monitoring people who are working at home. All kinds of devices, wearable technologies, and so on are being used. And the whole business of shopping from home is another one that has prompted another industry of surveillance. And you may have noticed the same Ron Deibert that did the Massey lectures had a piece in the Globe and Mail on Saturday in which he was examining the kinds of systems that are being used for proctoring student examinations, the invigilation apps and systems that are highly surveillant and collecting all kinds of data. So there are many other things in what I'm now calling pandemic surveillance that are tremendously important. And these go beyond anything that we have ever seen in the world of surveillance. One might think that the attacks on New York and Washington in 2001 were productive of a massive range of surveillance systems, and they certainly were. They are nothing compared with what is currently being unleashed on the world. Now, in the little article that I made, I talked about 4 jolts to our thinking that should really revolve around, I was suggesting, for start, the idea that is so frequent in our minds that the iconic symbol of surveillance is the video camera, publicly located video cameras. Well, really, it is time for us to put that idea to bed. Not that surveillance cameras aren't tremendously important, not that facial recognition and AI aren't making them more and more seamless with other forms of surveillance, but that the key vehicle of surveillance is now the smartphone. It is the smartphone through which all these systems that I've just been referring to are mediated. And so that's the starting point, to think about what data are going through the smartphone, what stays in the smartphone, what is going beyond the smartphone. And then there's the point about it being not just the state. Those of us raised on 1984 and George Orwell immediately think when we hear the word surveillance that it's all about the state and state activities. And of course, there again, it still is about the state, but it's very much the state and the market today. And that is another vital part of the equation that we cannot but examine if we're going to understand what is going on in surveillance today. The third jolt that I wanted to give the audience, whoever's listening, is that it's not just suspects. Surveillance is not just about following, tracking, monitoring, trying to get a hold of what's going on with people who are suspects. It's everyone. Everyone is a suspect, if you like. Everyone is a target. And this is surveillance for sorting. It's reputation driven. And that, again, is something that really has to be understood. And lastly, it's not just privacy, it's data justice. Early computerization obliged governments to show that what is needed is something to regulate the ways that personal data are collected for more and more purposes. And privacy laws were intended to address those kinds of issues. Now, privacy laws address all kinds of things, but I want to suggest that there is one thing that is missing both from privacy law and actually from Zuboff's work, which has to do with the unfairness, the social inequalities that are created and reinforced by many kinds of surveillance, from predictive policing to consumer profiling. This is the social sorting that I referred to a moment ago. And our next speaker will pick up some of those themes too. And this is why I think that the quest of better regulation what the Privacy Commissioner would like, should concern itself not only at the individual level of my privacy, but should also see this as a social matter of fairness and equality. As Lynette Taylor says, the power of data to sort, categorize, and intervene has not yet been explicitly connected to a social justice agenda by agencies and authorities around the world. Data justice, as I understand it, has to do with the way that people are seen, made visible, are represented, and are treated through our production of digital data. And this challenges both data regulation and the idea of our being made visible is just somehow an inevitable aspect of living in a digital world. So privacy might be a casualty of what's happening, but it seems to me that questions of fairness and justice, data justice, in fact, are what is really required here. And that will help us to put the other issues in context. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, David. In that case, that passes the baton very nicely over to Jane. Jane, do you want to pick up on that that theme of justice, of this pandemic of surveillance? Pandemic surveillance is hitting everybody, but it's not hitting everybody equally. Do you want to pick up on that one, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks to Benoit and David as well. I come to you this evening from unceded Algonquin territory, which is, I think, a fitting remark when we're talking about pandemic surveillance and the fact that it does affect us all, but it does not affect us all equally. And so when I think in terms of justice, I think in terms of marginalized and equality-seeking communities who are disparately negatively impacted. In particular, what I'm going to focus on is by the algorithmic sort. And there can be many reasons for this, including the fact that discrimination can be actually baked into the algorithms that sort through data to make decisions about everything from the results generated in response to a Google search to whether we receive an ad for a job or for available rental housing, to whether facial recognition technologies will match us with images of perpetrators of crime, to whether predictive policing technologies will identify our neighborhoods as high risk and thus in need of increased state surveillance purportedly. Sometimes these discriminatory outcomes have been the result of intentionally discriminatory decisions, such as disclosed last year when CBC reported that employers were purposely using Facebook's ad service to exclude younger and older workers from receiving job ads. Sometimes these discriminatory outcomes result from failure to pay adequate attention to whether the data sets on which algorithms and AI systems are trained actually include people from a broad range of social locations, such as with facial recognition technology systems by IBM, by Microsoft, by Amazon, that MIT researcher and founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, Joy Buolamwini, showed to have misclassified the gender of Black women 35 times more often than for lighter skinned men. And I've given you a link to a story about the Algorithmic Justice League and Joy Buolamwini. Sometimes these discriminatory outcomes result from being trained on data that itself reflects systemic discrimination, such as when predictive policing technologies rely on algorithms to identify certain neighborhoods or individuals as meriting increased surveillance based on pre-existing police data, which Kate Robertson, Cynthia Koo, and Yolanda Song, in their recent human rights analysis of algorithmic policing in Canada, have shown itself reflects entrenched racial and class bias towards members of historically disadvantaged communities. And I'm just going to give you a link in the chat to that report. In all of these cases, algorithms are being used to achieve discriminatory outcomes inconsistent with human rights and/or constitutional protections relating to equality. As a result, in a number of instances, legal complaints can and have been filed. Of course, the trouble with that is that legal systems are inaccessible to most people, particularly members of poorer, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities already laboring under racism, classism, colonialism, and other intersecting oppressions. And in addition, any remedy comes after the harm has been done. And even if the inaccessibility of the legal system could be addressed, in many cases, people are often not even aware they have been targeted by discriminatory algorithmic sorting. As a result, we're often dependent on civil society organizations like the Algorithmic Justice League or Citizen Lab or privacy commissioners' offices to occasionally investigate and disclose systemic discrimination via algorithms. And while those of us who sit in privileged positions may think that this is an acceptable exchange for the benefits and conveniences and purported safety, now in the context of COVID-19, purportedly associated with algorithmic sorting, members of marginalized communities are once again left to pay the price of a free market approach to innovation. From paying higher prices for college prep tests due to being profiled as Asian, to being more likely to have ads for criminal record checks associated with Google searches on their names because they are Black sounding, to being falsely arrested and imprisoned due to police reliance on faulty matches generated by biased facial recognition technology, members of marginalized communities are disproportionately left to bear the consequences of the algorithmic sort. And we're at a momentous time in history for more than the reason of COVID-19. Social justice movements such as Black Lives Matter and Idle No More are making it increasingly difficult for even the most privileged among us to deny the impacts of racism on the lives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. In this context, we cannot, in good conscience, stand by while systemic bias is buried under the glossy mathematical facade of the algorithmic sort in the all too often unquestioned drive for innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. I'd never thought of it before, but the idea of a big algorithm is watching you is I find just as creepy as the telephone, or in fact, as David says, the two probably go together. Anatoly, we'll go on to you. You've been looking at the privacy aspects of this and what is being done elsewhere, because of course Canada is not addressing this all by itself. We've got a privacy law. That privacy law, actually, as David mentioned, is coming up. Other places have dealt with this. What can you bring to us on this one, please?
Mm-hmm. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel. Thank you for joining us. And if you're watching the recordings, welcome to you as well. I'll briefly tell you a little bit about research we do at the Social Media Lab related to the topic of this panel. And then Stephen, I'll answer your question in terms of how we compare to some other, like, data privacy regulations outside Canada. So in the Social Media Lab, we study how social media changes the way people and organizations communicate, collaborate, and share information. And of course, as more people use social media, relying on social media for various purposes, especially during the time of the pandemic, we also contribute more data to various websites. And so that data is being used, as my colleagues already noted, for all kinds of reasons. And so as a result, the question of how do you properly handle social media data is the focus of discussion and concerns of not just social media users themselves, but also concern of social media researchers and others who are accessing and relying on this type of data for decision making. What we're finding out as we're looking at this notion of social media data use and misuse, that this is social media data and other digital trace data is very multifaceted, and it requires a common framework to examine it through multiple lenses, so through technical, ethical, and policy kind of angles. And so to help us understand this, we using this notion of data stewardship. Data stewardship is the concept usually used to describe and study how people manage data in labs, in the lab environments, usually in hard sciences. But this notion also well suited to study all kinds of data, because it already covers different aspects of data management aspects. But unlike data generated in labs by researchers, we also note that social media data is generated by users and being curated by social media platforms. So researchers and other data consumers kind of have to negotiate policies and expectations from both sides, user side and platform side. And also consider not just technical issues, but also ethical issues associated with reliance on such data. From a number of empirical studies we've conducted, we know that social media users accept the use of their social media data by third parties if the outcome will be generally used for a good cause, public good, and especially if it's used by nonprofit or academic research. We also know that social media users care about the data quality, accuracy, and representation, and that they really want to make sure that the special considerations are given to when people use data for sensitive topics or studying vulnerable groups. And I'll just quickly wrap it up this part to say that social media data stewardship, this framework we're using to understand different aspects of this notion, is there's no one-size-fits-all framework. And this is because expectation of privacy varies across users, and data types. So essentially, you might feel differently if I ask you, are you okay if your employer uses your data to make recruitment decisions versus a marketer using your data to target you with ads. And then you will ask me, what kind of data are you, maybe it's okay for them to use certain public posts you made versus not okay to use private images. So there's all these different dimensions we have to consider when developing this common framework. And what we also realize, and interestingly, that people's privacy attitudes are quite similar when we ask them about privately available data versus publicly available data, because originally we thought there may be major differences, but seems to be not to be the case. So this is a kind of general discussion of what we do in the social media lab in the context of studying how people's attitudes towards have third parties using social media data. Regarding the question of what other countries are doing in the regulatory space, and this is more related to the conversation piece that I authored as part of a little series here. So I've looked at the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, that many of you know was enacted in the European Union a couple of years ago, and it's kind of been used as an example of data and privacy regulation around the world. But interestingly, so what the regulation, the GDPR regulation, finds itself now is that it's now in conflict with some of the emerging technologies that out there. And specifically, I looked at blockchain networks, and because I'm interested in social media use and users, I look at blockchain-based social media platforms. And so these are the platforms, there are some examples like Steemit, Minds, Nemo. You might have not heard of them yet. The adoption rate is still relatively low, at least in Canada. But those who are using those platforms, essentially, they're not relying on centralized entity like Facebook and Twitter to that their data is not being managed by that one entity. And it also gives social media users some incentives for engagement. So they get something out of the network. It's not just you being used as a product. But unfortunately, these type of technologies are now in conflict with the GDPR, because under the GDPR framework, there's understanding of there's one single data controller, like Facebook and Twitter, who controls personal data from individuals and responsible for protecting such data. But in the peer-to-peer blockchain networks, like the one the ones I mentioned, this ledger that stores all of the data that comes from users and interaction data is distributed across multiple nodes, multiple users. So there's no single entity to control it. And so as a result, it's quite challenging to apply GDPR framework to this type of technology. And there are a number of issues that this GDPR regulation conflicts with this the blockchain networks. So I find it an interesting and of course lesson kind of for us here in Canada, how to make sure that our future privacy and data regulation that is currently being considered and proposed, making sure that it's flexible enough to account for current and future emerging technologies. That might actually give users more freedom and control over their own data. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to your engaging questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anatoly. Thank you very much, everyone. Our first question has come in from Monica Hiller. Monica, do you want to open your mic and talk to us, or do you want me to read it out? Please go ahead.
Non, Steven, vas-y toi.
Okay. Monica's posing a question initially to Benoît and David. Pourriez-vous dire un peu plus sur les rapports entre les États et les marchés et les effets de ce sur les frontières politiques et les processus que vous avez décrivés? For Benoît and David, can you speak a little bit more about these linkages between states and markets and how this affects, how this is affected by political frontiers and what you're seeing there?
You want to go first?
Benoît, would you like to go first?
Okay.
Vas-y.
So I think that it's a very interesting question because we always assumed that surveillance was the remit of the state and only states had enough technological power and the needs to collect all this amount of data. And we realized that the private sector and big companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and other companies that we know less about but still are very active, collect massive amounts of data and actually are collecting all these digital and physical breadcrumbs. I don't know if you saw on PBS, I think it was a few weeks back, a fantastic documentary on Amazon and how Amazon is colonizing every single area of business, including the Ring cameras on each doorbell to try to capture images of what's happening in every single street in America and using actually the police to market their product. So it's not the governments using private technologies, it's the private sector using the government to market surveillance technologies. And we need to, when we think about surveillance and infoveillance and the infrastructure, to understand that sometimes the private sector is calling the shots and the private sector is offering solutions, ready-made solutions off the shelves to governments. This is exactly what's happening with the smart cities movement. I was sitting over the past couple of days on the Interpol annual conference, and I saw a number of presentations where clearly, the projects conducted by national law enforcement organizations were driven and inspired by large multinational corporations trying to offer and develop technologies, surveillance technologies that would be marketed as smart cities technologies, providing safety to citizens. So we need to understand this interplay between the public and the private sectors a lot better and to make sure these are embedded into our theoretical frameworks. And I know it's a kind of, I'm rambling, but trying to make sense of a very, very dispersed ecosystem.
Thank you, Benoît. David, would you like to come in on the back of that?
Back in the 1990s, I often had arguments with the then privacy commissioner in Ontario. And this person said to me, well, your understanding of surveillance is far too broad. Really, we need to just focus on the things that the Privacy Acts cover and focus on those alone. But I said, listen, there are so many things going on in the world of what I think of as surveillance that actually should be under your jurisdiction. You should be thinking about these things. So it's partly a question of how we define surveillance. We've assumed for a very long time that, as Benoit says, it's a kind of state activity. But if you think of surveillance as the routine and focused and systematic attention to personal details for some specific purposes, whatever they are, influence, management, entitlement, control, and so on, then you can see both state surveillance and commercial surveillance in the same framework. And I think it's very helpful and appropriate to do that, especially as today, things that for decades were not really thought of in terms of surveillance. I mean, long before Orwell, the Syndicat d'Henri in Montreal used to collect data on consumers. They had it in big ledgers, and they used the data that they had in order to decide who was an appropriate and who was an inappropriate consumer. Some people were simply pushed aside. And so that sort of thing, once the opportunity for digitization at the end of the 20th and now very much in the 21st century came about, you had those systems growing and becoming more and more influential. I'll give you just one example. After 9/11, who did the newly minted Department of Homeland Security go to for help? Did they go to the FBI? No. Did they go to the NSA? No. Did they go to the CIA? No. They went to CRM. Never heard of that?
No.
Customer Relationship Management. They went to CRM. That was their understanding that already the corporations knew more about how to pinpoint the people that they were wanting to target. In other words, how that could be shifted over to thinking about looking for suspected terrorists than any of those agencies would be able to help them.
And I would just add to David's, and also they went to libraries, the essential information centers that had at the time all the records what people read and check out from the libraries. Now, of course, you have platforms, social media platforms, and others having all that treasure trove of data.
Thank you. Jane, yes, thank you. Please, Jane, go ahead. I wanted to bring you in on this one as well.
Yeah, just to build on what David was saying, in terms of the political process itself, we see the manifestation of this growing sense of dependency by the state on these massive market players. And so when you go into policy processes, you see that the power that these organizations have with respect to the way that policy gets drafted. And who has a place at the table, and you see it even in legal decision making, with some notable moves over the last couple of years. But a sort of a sense that we are beholden to this form of datafied society. Our economy depends on it. Everything depends on it. And when we have a relationship between the market and the state that looks like that, it's a recipe for democratic disaster, which I think is right where we're headed unless we rethink our regulatory structure.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. Thank you, everyone. Look, that was interesting. And anyway, look, I'll go on. We've got another question coming in from Tom Nesmith. Tom is asking, if proper regulation is the key to appropriate data gathering, and in order to curb excessive data gathering, do you think that there is society value in long-term retention of such proper data? Or is such data still so dangerous to the individual and the public good that we just can't keep on keeping it? Anatoly, would you like to take a lead on starting that one, please?
I'll try to be brief. I see we only have about 9 minutes. But I think regulation is an answer, but not to everything, and we have to have measured approach. We have to include multiple stakeholders, as the example I gave earlier in terms of regulations versus other emerging technologies like blockchain networks. There's always will be, regulations always will be behind innovation, technological innovations, what our industry is doing, how people use their own data. So I think we cannot put all the eggs in one basket, but we have to bring the social media users as well. I do like the idea of data portability notion to kind of empower users where they can actually decide where and how to use their data, but that will come with supportive technologies that would allow such a data portability, but it will also require a bit of education and literacy skills that would enable all citizens to do that, because it might not be trivial at the beginning. So only, again, going back to Jane's point about the inequalities in this space. So if you have something like that's really awesome for data users and only few can benefit from it, then you create this inequality in the market. I'll let other panelists to take on that as well. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Would someone else like to come in on that one? Jane, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think what I've been thinking about a lot lately is, yes, regulation will be behind innovation as long as law and regulation is playing the innovation game, as long as we're playing the innovators game. I think we're playing the innovators game when we look at this as a data protection issue, because then we're constantly trying to chase an understanding of what's happening with the data, how is it being used, how is it being stored, how can we impose fair information practices with respect to the use and retention of data. I'd like to see us flip the script a little bit and say, let's begin with things that we already know. We've got some basic fundamentals. We've got some basic human rights fundamentals. And what if we were to say, as we have done in other areas, including environmental regulation, certain outcomes aren't acceptable. And discriminatory outcomes are an example of that. And so those who produce discriminatory outcomes will be held responsible. As long as we're chasing their model, their data in exchange for services model, I think law is destined to be behind. That's why I'd like to see us try to get out in front of it with some solid human rights-based principles, rather than scampering to try to amend data protection regulations.
Thank you very much, Jane. David or Benoit, would you like to come in on that one? Benoit?
Yes, I'd just like to add as well that data is not the enemy, because actually data is very important if you want to demonstrate that there are biases at play. So the thesis that Jane mentioned, the work at MIT, wouldn't be possible if the researcher was not able to demonstrate that Black women were systematically discriminated against by AI. So she needed a lot of data to be able to do that. And we need a lot of data to be able to show and to demonstrate the biases and discriminations at play. France is a country that doesn't collect racial data, and there is no systemic racism problem in France because they don't have any data, and they structure the lack of data to be able to kind of refuse to look at the problem. So we also need to be able to use data to the benefit of discriminated and underrepresented communities, and not only to kind of negate the need to have data as a higher principle.
Thanks, Benoit.
Yeah.
David.
Yeah, that ties in with what I was thinking about what Anatoly had said, Benoit. And you say that we should recognize that there are great benefits to data and using data, and I totally agree. But Anatoly talked about ensuring that all stakeholders were involved. And the one bunch of stakeholders that, well, no, there are probably several, but one of them I find a very striking omission in our discussion so far is computer scientists and software engineers and so on. They are also stakeholders in this. They're critically important stakeholders. And they're the ones who are creating the algorithms that Jane was talking about, and so on. And I think that we have a task as a society, and especially as people within the universities, to try to encourage our colleagues in those fields to think outside of the box in which they've been trained. There's plenty of evidence. I have a colleague here at Queen's who has done work with computer scientists and trying to understand how they come to their task when they're building algorithms. And she argues that in all the cases that she has looked at, both in Germany, where she did some of her work, and in Canada, computer scientists frequently tend to dissociate from the actual task that they're doing. It's seen as building an elegant algorithm rather than what they are building the algorithm for. And they tend to disengage, she says, from the actual social and political dimension of the very things that they are engaged in doing. So I think there are two sides to that data question. Yes, we should be highly respectful of the potentially excellent and human-oriented uses of data, but we should also encourage our friends in computing and software and so on to take very seriously the purposes for which they are building their systems, creating their algorithms, and so on.
Oh, thank you very much, David. Thank you very much to Le Monde. Thank you very much, merci beaucoup to Le Monde. We are about to run out of time, I think. So before we get cut off, or before everyone leaves us, I would just like to say thank you very much to all the participants for joining us on this Tuesday night, or Tuesday afternoon if you're in the West. A huge thanks to our four panelists. This has really been an excellent discussion. I really want to say thank you very much. I've enjoyed being part of this. I've enjoyed learning from you. And I hope that other people appreciate this half as much as I have. So with that, I will finish and say thank you very much. If any of our speakers would like to do a final word, I will hand it back over to them. They're the experts here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and all the very best, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the RSC COOE. And thank you for joining us. Good night. All right. Well, thank you for those who are still here. Thanks, Russell. Thanks very much, Jane. Oh, Jane's just logged out as well.
Thank you, Stephen. That was great. Well done. Well steered.
Well, it was good fun.
Yeah.
I'd initially thought the timing might be too long, but we could have quite happily had a little bit more time on that.
We could have kept going. Yeah. Great. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you. Bye.